Jeffro from Two Hacks Garage. Well, I came up with a name for this 292 cubic inch engine. Mind you, it's based off the 283 small block. I'm going to call it the DZ292. As I explained, I'm building this to as close specs as I can to the 1967 302 small block Chevy that was introduced pretty much for Trans Am racing. I know the DZ moniker didn't come out till later on, but everyone pretty much knows that 4-inch bore, 3-inch stroke, high revving little ripper as the DZ302. So the little brother to it, the what if engine as I call it, because to me it's extremely intriguing of what would have happened if they would have done that, I'm going to call it the DZ292. So that's going to be the project name moving forward. With that, guys, what are we doing today? Well, we're going to install a crankshaft in this thing. If you noticed in the video I did on my 311, I used a dial bore gauge, installed the main caps, measured my main bearing clearance that way. However, in this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use plastic gauge. I'm going to use that method. I'm going to show you how to do that. And we're going to show you how to install this crankshaft using studs. There's a reason why, and we're going to get to that here in a few, of why I'm putting studs in this instead of bolts. With that, let's go check out the parts we're working with. All right, so here we go, guys. I'm working with a factory steel 283 crankshaft. This is the 5822. A lot of people know that as the part number for the 302 engine, because mind you, they originally started using the 283 cranks to get the 3-inch stroke in those 67 283s. However, there's a difference between the 5822 302 one and the standard steel. While they're both steel forged cranks, the difference is back here on the flange. The flange on the 302 is actually notched, and they're actually going to have a little bit more of a lighter gray color. The 302 cranks were nitrided for hardness, and these are not. However, it's a steel crank. For what I'm building, it's going to be perfectly fine. This one here, it's been ground 10 under on the rods and the mains, and this was recently balanced up at Don's Auto Parts in Kenosha, Wisconsin. They also did my Eagle crank for my 311. So that's the crankshaft that we're working with. Also, mind you guys, on the actual oiling holes on the journals, they have been chamfered for better oiling, so that's a performance upgrade. And the 283 cranks, on the snout, everything was pressed in. They weren't drilled and tapped. However, we went ahead and took care of that on this one for the harmonic balancer. So yes, there's the crankshaft we're working with. Let's take a look at the parts we're going to be using. Fel Pro 2900 rear main seal. And got to give a huge shout out to my friend Brian from B&R Racing. He helped me locate a set of new old stock Vandervell bearings. These are 10 under. Exactly what I need. These are a really, really good bearing. If you can find these for a good street build, I would highly recommend them. So once again, Brian, thanks for finding these for me. I'm going to enjoy putting those in. And I'm using ARP kit. If you look here, it is the small block Chevy 2-bolt small journal with wedge tray, aka windage tray. I do not have a factory windage tray for this. Kind of hard to find at a decent price and one in good shape. So that's why I'm using this, because right there I have a new old stock Moroso kit windage tray. It's got a crank scraper and it's got a baffle for the oil pump. Probably just going to use the windage tray, and I might use those other parts for my 311. Not 100% sure yet. So that's why I'm going with this stud kit, because it accepts a windage tray. So yeah, those are the parts that I'm working with. Let's go take a look at what kind of tools we're going to need for this. All right, the tools we're going to be working with are pretty basic. I've got 2 torque wrenches. We'll explain that later on when we go to use those. A speed wrench, that really comes in handy when you're just pre-torquing stuff down. You don't over-torque anything. We got a mallet for setting the thrust on the rear main part. Socket that's going to fit the bolts on that. We got a T-handle for them studs. We got ARP fastener lube and my favorite Clevite bearing assembly lube. Some Loctite for those studs, and we have our plastic gauge. So yeah, that's the basics of the tools right there. And if you want to go look over here, here's the engine block we're working with. Now, mind you, like I always say, you want to work in a clean and quote-unquote sterile environment. So what I did was, not only did I go over there and really clean up all the journals on there, I went ahead and make sure everything on here is clean. All the surfaces clean of debris and grease and dirt and grime, anything like that. And all your main journal holes, I made sure those were also clean. Like I said, clean engine is a happy engine. Okay, so what the first step you're going to do is you're going to install your cam bearings. There are two style of bearings. There's an upper and a lower. Now, mind you, since this block is upside down, this is actually the upper. Your main caps are actually the lower. But if you see here, you have your main journal feed holes. When you look at the bearings, one of them's grooved with a hole and one of them isn't. Well, you're going to put the ones that are grooved with the hole down there. And the way you do it's actually pretty simple. And you want to make sure your cam bearings are free of any grease, debris, or anything. Same thing here. You want everything clean and dry. And you see that tang right there? That tang actually lines up there in the block. So all you're going to do is your first step is you're going to line up your cam bearings in here and just make sure they're dry and clean. So they just pretty much snap into place like that. And what you're going to do is you're going to go down the line and you're going to do all of them. Just like that. Tang to tang, as they say. And the rear one, it's the same way. Your oil feed holes are a little different. If you look there, this is your thrust. You can see that in the block. So you're going to want to make sure that that hole lines up to that hole. Now, mind you, with this build, we are going to install a rear main seal. However, to check the main bearing clearance, that's not going to be important right now. So get that down and get it flush. So right now, these are installed, and what I'm going to do is go to the next step. Here's a little important tip before we get started. No, the oil pan is not installed. I'm actually doing some mock-up work, and you're probably wondering, why am I going from installing a crankshaft to doing mock-up? Well, I'm using some aftermarket parts with this. Even though I'm using the stock crank, I am using an ARP stud kit that's raised for that windage baffle, and I'm using an aftermarket pan. I know I'm trying to stick as close as I can to the stock specs. However, I am going to run a 7-quart pan on this just for better oiling on this engine. Stock one was 4 quarts. And you know what, guys? I really want to make sure this is safe. So this is a good point now where I'm mocking stuff up. So I have the pan laid down on here with my windage system installed. And I know it clears. And another good thing, let me set this down real quick. If you see what I did here, is I do have the studs in place that I'm going to use. And since there's a location for these, I needed to find out exactly where they were going. So I went ahead and put the raised studs in place, got it all mocked up. I'm using an ARP stud in the back that's going to mount the oil pump in place, but that's for another video. I just needed to make sure everything was going to clear. Now, this is also important with something like this with different stroke cranks. I'm using a 3-inch stroke crank, so I'm pretty sure this is all going to clear. But when you're mocking, when you're doing this, it's a good idea if you're using aftermarket parts internally that can interfere with other things. Stroker crank, well, that might actually hit this. So what did I do? Let me take this off, show you real quick. All I did was I took the studs from that stud kit, I located them where they needed to be, finger tight, that's also important, in place, put everything down, put that windage tray down, put it in place like it would be when it's sitting in the engine, and I installed that pan. Now what I'm going to end up doing with this is, after I get everything in place, obviously I'm not going to install the windage tray just yet, but I will put that back on there and rotate the crank at the end of the video, make sure there's no clearance issues. So yeah, I just stopped here just for a brief moment to mock things up. Using aftermarket parts, it's extremely important to mock things up. One other quick tip, if you've watched my videos, you know I like labeling everything. So I don't do this every day, so I like to get everything labeled. If you notice, I have the cylinders labeled, 2468 or 1357. But what I did here, because if you notice, these aren't windage studs. They're the taller ones. So just so I don't forget when I go to put everything together for the final assembly, I went ahead and just wrote on all 4 of those, WS, windage stud. It always helps just to mark things down so you don't forget. Next step, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to insert the upper halves of the main bearings in the caps. Now, mind you, your main bearings do go in order. They are numbered. Make sure you put them in the right orientation, and they usually have an arrow on each one that says front of the block. So yes, put your shells or put your bearing shells in the main caps, get them in there nice and clean, make sure they're debris free, and make sure they're in order. All right, so the next step of this is actually pretty easy. Once you got your main bearing caps in here, or your main bearings in the block, and you got the main bearings in the cap, you want to make sure this is all lint-free, clean, like I've been preaching. And all we're going to do is set the crankshaft in here. Now, when you get it set in here, very carefully, you don't want to rotate it. You just want to set it in there, in place, extremely carefully, because everything is dry. There is no lubrication anywhere on this. And in order to do plastic gauge correctly, well, that's kind of how you have to do it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, like I said, very, very carefully set this down in there. Just like so. There we go. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and check main bearing clearance. If you notice, I'm not 100% exactly where I need to be on the crank. So what I'll probably do is just slightly lift this up and rotate it so I have a better spot on these journals here. If you notice here on the oil sides of it, it's not exactly where 100% where you want to be. Kind of want to be on more of a flat surface. So I'm just going to carefully lift this up, rotate it to a better spot, and then put it back down in place. Just like that. So next, I'm going to put my plastic gauge on the journals. And it's kind of hard to see, but you see that little piece? You don't need a big piece. And you're going to want to put them long ways on each of the journals. So like right here, I'm going to stick that down. You want to be careful. And all I did was on that front piece right there. Let me see if I can zoom in. You see right there, it's right on the top of that. It's just laid right across the middle. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do that on each of the journals. All right, so on each of the journals, it's kind of hard to see, but I do have a piece of plastic gauge on there. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my main caps on here, and down the line, you want to go straight down. You want to be careful. Like I said, you want to orient them correctly. Make sure you get them in the right spot. You just want to carefully put them on there. You don't want to wiggle them. You just want to get them down in place where they need to be. And you're going to do that to every single one of them. You're going to get them all put into place. And then what you're going to do is you're going to put your studs in and where they need to go. And you're going to finger tighten them. Since these are studs, you don't tighten them down. You just want to get them to the base and finger tight. Now, mind you, what I did is I'm going to end up Loctiting these, but you don't ever really put these in dry when you go torquing on them. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a little bit of the assembly grease, the ARP supplies, which I'll have to clean off along with the threads, and so I can Loctite these later on. But what I need to do now is I need to get all my main caps in, and I need to get my studs into place. See you in a few. All right, so I got the studs in place, finger tight. And the next step, all I'm going to do is I'm going to take my washers here, and I'm going to put all the washers on over that. And I'm going to dab a little bit of oil when I put it on there. And then what you're going to see me do is I'm going to go through with the ARP fastener lube. I'm going to wipe a little on there. And then I'm going to get these down and put them on there just finger tight for now. All right, so I got everything snug in place. Now, mind you, when you're doing this, be careful not to turn the crankshaft. So now what we need to do is we need to torque these down. So you need to look at your paperwork, and they're calling for 80 foot-pounds of torque in 3 equal segments. So in this case, that would be 30, 55, and 80. Remember I showed you 2 torque wrenches earlier? Well, it's because my big torque wrench doesn't go down that low. So I'm going to use one of them to go through and torque everything to 30. And then I'll get my other torque wrench out and I will go to 55 and then I'll go to 80. All right, so everything is torqued into place. I've let it sit for a few minutes. Now what I need to do is I need to start going through and checking my main bearing clearance. The way I like to do this, and everybody has got their way, of course, but I like doing it one journal at a time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this one off and I'm going to check it and I'm going to go down the line and do the same thing. We're going to show you the first one. So first thing first, guys, what I need to do is I need to take that cap off. You got to be careful on this step. Get that loosened up. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take off the bolt, or the nut, sorry, and washer. I'm actually going to take these studs out. It makes it a whole lot easier. I'll show you why. So once you get your hardware off of there, what you're going to want to do is take your studs out. Now, mind you, when I go to put all this back together, I'm going to clean those threads out and I'm going to put Loctite on them. And per the instructions, you just go finger tight. So now that I got those out, put it with the rest of the hardware, what I like to do is just pop this thing up. So now that I got it popped up, what you can see on the main cap there and on the journal is that plastic gauge crushed. So what we're going to do, we're going to show you what that looks like. All right, so if you look right there on that mark, that's a smashed piece of plastic gauge, and then you have your gauge. Here, what you're going to do is you're going to line it up and try to find the closest one. Sometimes it's in between, and you're just taking a guesstimate at it. I'll be honest, dial bore gauge is much more accurate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to line this thing up. It's not, obviously it's not 1/1000ths, it's not 1.5 thousandths, but it's not as quite as thin as 2/1000ths. So on the mains, I'm going to call that about 1 3/1000ths on there. So not exactly loose, but not exactly tight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and do all the rest of those. And I do record all these numbers. So in my book over there, I'm going to start writing these down and I'll be back with you once I get them all checked. All right, so I got all the main bearing clearances checked. It's a little tight, but it is going to be a street engine. It's about 1 3/4 thousandths to about 2 thousandths on everything. So yeah, that's where we're at with that. So what I'm going to do next is main bearings are in. So the next step is I'm going to lube everything up. I'm going to lube up the caps with the bearings in them, and I'm going to start getting things installed. Now, mind you, when I do this, I am going to be I cleaned everything up. I'm going to be putting Loctite on the studs that are going in there. And what I'm going to end up doing with that then is I'm going to install the main caps. I'm going to get everything torqued down. You'll see me tap on the crankshaft back here. That's setting the thrust bearing. You got to get those caps aligned. So this is going to be the final assembly. So to kind of walk through it, you lube everything up with the Clevite assembly lube. So you lube this shell, you lube the lower shell that's in the cap. You put your main studs in, like I said, with this, since it's going to be somewhat of a permanent installation, I'm going to Loctite those. When you put your caps on, you're going to put a little more of the ARP thread lubricant on there, and then you're going to torque everything down. But before you get everything torqued down, once it's down to about 20 foot-pounds, like I said, you're going to tap it with the mallet back and forth and back, and that's going to set your thrust. We're going to check in play on that later. Then from there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the final torque sequence. So it's going to go 30, 55, and 80. Then we'll check crank in play, and we'll see how it rolls over. But I also do need to get the rear main seal in here. I showed in the other video. It's nothing crazy. Basically, you tilt it up about 3/8 of an inch out of the block, put a little goop on that silicone, do the same thing with the other one in the cap, set it down, and you're good to go. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on the final assembly of this, and see you soon. All right, so what I did was I put the windage tray back on real quick. I want to make sure that the crankshaft is going to clear. Now, mind you, the windage tray is semi-adjustable. If you look underneath here, you see these threads. Well, that's where they stop for the studs are, but you can actually move this up and down. So where are we at right now with this? Well, if you can see right there, yeah, we're clearing. We got clearance. Got them back there. When I put my rods and pistons and everything in, you know what, guys? I'm going to check that too. So just want to make sure everything's going to clear with the bolts. But yeah, so far we're looking pretty good. Not too shabby. All right, so there we have it. Thrust checked out okay. It was about 5 thousandths. Yeah, all done. If you want a little bit more detailed in depth, in my other video series where I'm building my 311 cubic inch small block Chevy, I go in a little bit more detail. However, you know what? I'm building this one too, and it's pretty awesome. I really like it. Crank turns over nice. It's very smooth. So yeah, crankshaft is installed in the DZ292 here pretty soon. Well, guess what, guys? We're probably going to be putting some pistons and rods in this bad boy. See you in the next one.